Hey everyone, and welcome to today's video. And in today's video I want to talk about inch and centimeter. And for everyone new to my channel, I just want to quickly give you an overview of what you can find on my YouTube channel and why this topic of inch and centimeter is important to me. So I love to make interactive mini albums and folios. And when I say interactive, I mean that I like to include all those interactive elements to my albums and folios, such as pockets or flaps, but also some swing features and different closure types. And of course, I share everything I craft with you on this channel, but then I also do video tutorials so that you can actually craft along and make your own albums and folios. And so far, all my video tutorials are only available in English, but as I said in my previous video, they soon will also be available in German on my YouTube channel. And all those tutorials actually come with the coordinating cutting guides, which you can purchase in my Etsy store. In those cutting guides, you can find the measurements for each element to actually build the folio or the mini album. And I also include templates with my cutting guides so that you can easily see what your elements are supposed to look like so that you know how to score and how to cut them. And for my cutting guides, they are also only available with measurements in inch so far. So because, as I said, I also want to now upload my videos not only in English but also in German, I also had to ask myself if I also want to do my cutting guides in centimeters as well. And as I also mentioned in my previous video, I actually don't know if I really want to redo all my cutting guides so that I can make them available in centimeters as well. So I actually gave it another try and used centimeter measurements to make my folio number 1, because that will be the first tutorial which will also be available in German. And because I already have those measurements in centimeter for my folio number 1, this one will definitely be available in centimeters as well as in inches. But for all the other cutting guides, I actually don't want to promise that they also will be available with centimeters. And that's because I really do prefer to use inches instead of centimeters when crafting mini albums and folios, and I think there are a lot of different reasons why you should use inches as well. And as you may already know, I'm from Germany, so I actually grew up with using centimeters and I've never used inches before actually starting to craft mini albums and folios. And I also know other crafters from Germany who also changed from using centimeters to only using inches for crafting. So in this video today, I want to talk about the differences between inches and centimeter, how to read inches, how to use inches, and then of course why I actually prefer to use inches and think they're so much easier to use. So keep in mind that I'm not talking about those two measurements in like general, but I actually talk about the use of inches and centimeter for crafting. And then I also want to give you some recommendations for craft tools you could use to score and cut your papers, either when you're working in centimeters or in inches. And because this video got really long, I divided it into different parts so that you can easily skip a chapter and continue with the next one when you find some information not relevant or interesting to you. So after this quick introduction, I actually want to start with a closer look on the measurement inch and how it actually works. And I of course will try my best to explain inches very well, but I also want to quickly mention here that if you're still thinking after my explanation that inches are very complicated and you don't really get it, then I would recommend that you keep on watching this video and watch the following parts, because It's really more about the tools you are using and being able to actually read inches on your tools. And then I promise you, it's super easy with the right tools to use inches, even if you're not really understanding how they work, because I know that they're very different to centimeters. But yeah, I would say just keep on watching, and I'm pretty sure you will be fine. So here on the screen you can now see that there are two different divisions for scales in inches. So depending on which tools you have, you might have seen the division on the top, which is a little like smaller, or you have seen the division on the bottom, which is in larger steps. But if you're using my cutting guides, then you're totally fine with the scale on the bottom here, because I'm actually not using any of those smaller measurements. But if we look at the first division, you can actually see that it's divided in 16 different parts. And these parts are called sixteenths in this case. So now we have fractions of the whole part. And all those parts together would make 16 sixteenths. And to write down fractions, we have those two numbers and then the line between them. And the number above the line is called the numerator, which defines the parts of the whole unit. So in this case, it's 16 parts of the whole unit. And then we also have the denominator, which is underneath the line. And this is actually the parts which make up the whole unit. So in this case, we have divided it into 16 parts. So we have the 16 written here. But we, of course, can also divide the whole unit into bigger or smaller parts. So if you want to divide it in even smaller parts, then you would have to calculate it times 2, and then you would have a division in 30 seconds instead of sixteenths. And if you want to divide it in bigger parts, then you would have to calculate it by 2. So now you would have eighths instead of sixteenths. And as I said before, this is the division I'm using for my cutting guides and I'm working with. So for the rest of the video, the smallest division, the smallest part would be eighths we are talking about. So let's have a closer look on this division into 8 parts. So when we divide 1 inch into 8 parts, then of course the first line on the scale would be the line for 1/8 of an inch. And then we have 2/8 of an inch for the second line, so the second part. And then 3/8 of an inch, 4/8 of an inch, 5/8 of an inch, 6/8 of an inch, 7/8 of an inch, and then 8/8 of an inch, which again makes up 1 unit. So this would be the same as 1 inch. Now we of course can also divide it into even bigger parts. So now we divide it into quarters. So now the first line or part would be 1/4 of an inch. And as you can see here, 1/4 of an inch is exactly the same as 2/8 of an inch. But even if those two measurements mean exactly the same and are the same size, you wouldn't find the 2/8 on your scale, but instead it would be substituted by 1/4 of an inch. So every time you're able to divide your fraction by 2 and it leaves you with a new fraction, then you would actually do that. So now you'll want to have like the bigger part on your scale. So in this case, we can divide 2 by 2, which is 1, and then 8 by 2, which is 4. And this leaves us with 1/4 instead of 2/8. And we wouldn't be able to do that for 1/8 of an inch, so we cannot divide 1/8 of an inch by 2. So we would always use 1/8 of an inch for the measurements, but then we would use 1/4 of an inch for the next measurement. And then for the next measurement, in our division of quarters, we have 2/4 of an inch. And again, 2/4 of an inch is the same as 4/8 of an inch. So we can divide 4/8 by 2. So we divide 4 by 2, and this leaves us with 2. And then for 8 divided by 2, we have the 4. So now we have 2/4 of an inch as the fraction we want to use when working with inch. And it's the same for 3/4 of an inch, which would be the next measurement in the quarter division. And then we have the last measurement specification, which would be 4/4 of an inch. And as I said before, every time the number above the line and underneath the line are the same, we would actually have one whole unit. So 4/4 of an inch is the same as 1 inch. And then for the last division, we have divided 1 inch into two parts. So now we're talking about two halves. So there's actually just one specification, and this would be 1/2 of an inch. And as you can see here, 1/2 of an inch is the same as 4/8 of an inch, but then also the same as 2/4 of an inch. So you could divide 4/8 of an inch by 2, and then you can further divide the 2/4 of an inch by 2, and this would leave you with 1/2 of an inch. So that's where all those measurements on our like rulers and cutting tools and scoring tools are coming from. So the first measurement we can find on our tools is the measurement of 1/8 of an inch. Then we have 1/4 of an inch. Then we have 3/8 of an inch. Then 1/2 of an inch, 5/8 of an inch, 3/4 of an inch, 7/8 of an inch, and 1 inch. And as you can see, it then, of course, will be repeated. So then we have 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, 1/3/8 of an inch, 1/2 of an inch, and so on. So for example, this rectangle here measures 5/8 of an inch. And then for the next example, which is a much longer rectangle, this one measures 2 5/8 of an inch. And one first big advantage for me of working with inches is that we actually can like know the halves of the different measurements. So what I mean by that is that we know that the half of an inch is 1/2 of an inch, and then the half of a half of an inch is 1/4 of an inch, and the half of 1/4 of an inch is 1/8 of an inch. And I think this is very helpful when we want to make mini albums or folios. And to me, it's especially helpful to actually design my cutting guides. And to explain what I mean by that, I actually want to give you an example. So as you can see here, this is one of those page styles I really like including in my mini albums. And this is a gatefold page. So what you want to have here is you want to have two pieces which are half of the size of the basic page underneath. So these gates have to be the same size, and then when you lay them next to each other, they should make up the same size as the basic page. So let's say, for example, the basic page is 8 1/4 of an inch wide. Then you want your gates to be 4 1/8 of an inch wide. And if you want the basic page to be 8 1/2 of an inch wide, then of course your gates have to be of 4 1/4 of an inch. And you can, of course, also divide centimeters into halves, but then you are often left with measurements which are very small or just not easy to cut because you simply cannot find those smaller specifications, those smaller measurements on your rulers or cutting or scoring boards. But I will, of course, talk more about centimeters and the differences in a minute. Another example for when it's really helpful that we are able to divide and also multiply our measurements in inches is when you want to craft a border. So for all my elements and all my pages, I really like to have a small border of cardstock around the pattern papers or journaling cards I'm using to decorate my cardstock. And I like those borders to be of 1/8 of an inch size. And that means that my cardstock has to be 1/4 of an inch larger than my pen and papers. So if my cardstock is 4 1/4 by 6 1/4, then I want my pen and paper to be 4 by 6 inches. So now let's continue and compare inches with centimeters. And the first thing you'll probably notice is that 1 centimeter is way smaller than 1 inch. In fact, 1 inch equals 2.54 centimeters. And then 1 centimeter equals 0.39 inches, which is a little more than 3/8 of an inch. This is something you, of course, could do. So you could simply type in your measurements into any converter or simply Google, and then you would get the measurements converted to centimeter or inches. But for my cutting guides, which I have already available in inches, I wouldn't now like just convert them to centimeters because I don't think that those would be easy to work with. So instead, I would design my cutting guides with centimeters, with new measurements in centimeters. So that means that I'm not using any of those uneven centimeter measurements, but instead only measurements in centimeters, which are easy to work with. So this of course also means that my albums and folios in centimeters wouldn't be of the exact same size than those albums made with inches. But to fully get why I think that centimeters are not as easy to work with as inches, we of course now want to take a closer look on the centimeter measurements. So compared to inches, 1 centimeter is not divided into 8, but 10 different parts. And those are those 10 millimeters which make up 1 centimeter. And as same as for inches, we can also divide 1 centimeter in two halves. And one half of a centimeter would be 0.5 centimeters or 5 millimeters. And you would find this measurement on all of your tools, so you would be able to easily measure anything with half of a centimeter. But if you want to measure something like half of the centimeter, then it gets a little trickier because this is a measurement you wouldn't be able to find on your tool because this would be 0.25 centimeters. And because these are very small measurements, you wouldn't be able to find those on your tools. So there's no line or marking for you to perfectly cut something in, for example, 6.25 centimeters. But then also because those measurements are so small, I have to admit that this is not a big issue. So I would just go ahead for crafting and actually cut at 3 millimeters or at 2 millimeters, or I just use my tool and I try to have my paper like in between those lines of 2 and 3 millimeters. But then for different measurements, like smaller measurements or like more crooked measurements, like 0.27, I wouldn't even put those in my cutting guides because to me it doesn't make sense to have those in my cutting guides if you're not able to use them and you would use like different measurements instead. And as I said in the beginning, when talking about inches and centimeters for crafting, there's actually another thing we need to talk about, which is the most important when it comes to do I want to craft in inches or centimeters? And this is the tools we are using for crafting. Because in the end, you want to be able to use those measurements for cutting and scoring your papers. And this depends on the tools you're using. So you want to have tools which makes it really easy to work with those measurements you want to use. But before I want to talk more about the measurements you can find on the tools, or especially the markings and labelings of those measurements, I actually want to quickly mention here that there are a lot of different tools, especially cutting tools you could use. But this is actually a topic I could talk about in a whole different video, so I just want to keep it short here. So I would just recommend that you really look into it and find the perfect tool which works for you because for cutting, for example, there are guillotine trimmers which I really like to use, but then there are also those cutting boards and those come with rolling blades or with a knife as a blade. And then, of course, all those different cutting tools do actually have some advantages and disadvantages. But in today's video, it's of course more about those measurements, markings, and labelings you would find on your cutting and scoring tools and what you actually need to keep in mind when buying a tool to be able to really use it in the measurement you want to use. And I will give you recommendations on tools to use for inches and tools to use for centimeters. And then, of course, you will also find the direct links to the shops where you can buy those tools in my description box down below. But because there are so many tools you could buy, I again really want to encourage you that you take your time and do your research so that you find the perfect tool for you. So let's just start with the measurements and labelings for cutting in inches. So this is just what would be perfect to have on your tool. So especially if you're a beginner or you're just starting to work with inches, then you would of course want to have as much of those inches actually be labeled. But besides the measurements labeled on the scale on top of the cutting board, I also like to have this grid on the cutting board as well. And you don't really need it because, of course, you would align your paper with the top of the cutting board, so with a scale here, and then it should be perfectly straight. But I still find it very helpful to have those grids and align my paper all the way onto the line of these grids. But as you can see, I just put the grid for the quarters of an inch on this image. And of course, it would be even more perfect to also have those for the eighths of an inch. But to be honest, I don't know of any cutting board which comes with a grid for the eighths of an inch as well. And the first recommendation for cutting in inches would be this Guillotine Trimmer. And this one is by We Are Memory Keepers, or they just recently changed their name to We Are Makers. And this is a trimmer I'm using myself for cutting all my papers, my cardstock, and even my chipboard. And as you can see, it comes with a grid divided into quarters, which again, I really like to use. And then also most of those measurements in the scale on top of this cutting board are labeled, but there's no labeling for eighths of an inch. So there are of course still the markings for eighths of an inch, so you would be perfectly able to cut something in eighths of an inch. But to do so, you of course would need to be able to actually read those markings so that you know if this is the line for 1/8 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch, 5/8 of an inch, or 7/8 of an inch. And once you get used to working with inches, you actually really quickly know exactly which line is for which eighths of an inch. But if you're just starting with working with inches, then you would have to either count those eighths lines to know which one it is. Or if you have a ruler on which all those measurements, also the measurements in eighths of an inch, are labeled, then you could just use this and lay it next to the scale on this cutting board so that you know exactly which line is for, like, for example, 3/8 of an inch. Or you could also print out a guide, so that would be the same as with ruler, then you could just use it to lay next to the scale, or you could even print it out and then attach it to your cutting board if you want to. So now let's continue with cutting in centimeters. And same as for cutting in inches, you of course want your scale on the top of your cutting board. But for centimeters, like most of the time, you would actually only have those centimeters labeled and not the millimeters. And then for half of a centimeter, you usually would just have a longer line. So that shows you that this is half of a centimeter. And I also just know of cutting boards which have a grid divided into centimeters and not into like any smaller measurements than a whole centimeter. And I actually don't have any recommendation for you for cutting in only centimeters, but there will be some recommendation on first cutting and scoring in centimeters, and then secondly on cutting in centimeters and inches with the same cutting tool. And then most of the times we not only need to cut our cardstock, but we also want to score our cardstock. And if you want to work with inches and you need to score your paper, then I would recommend to get a scoreboard with all the different measurements labeled. And then you also want to be able to actually score at each of those measurements. So you want to be able to score at the eighths, at the quarters, at the halves, and of course at 1 inch. And you will definitely be able to find scoring boards which you can use to score at each eighth of an inch. And then the scoring board I'm using also comes with all those measurements labeled. So I'm using the We Are Makers scoreboard and I can highly recommend it because really with this scoreboard, nothing can go wrong. So even if you're just starting working with inches, this is totally easy to use because you have all the measurements labeled. And as I said, you can also score at each measurement. And when it comes to scoring in centimeters, then as far as I know, you would only be able to get scoring boards which allow you to score at each half of a centimeter. So with these scoring boards, you wouldn't be able to score at each millimeter, so that's something I need to consider when making my cutting guides with centimeter measurements. But that's really not a big issue. So with my cutting guides in centimeters, I could make sure that at least most of the time, maybe even always, you would be totally fine to score in those half of a centimeter steps. But then still, if I have to choose, I would choose inches because with inches, you still have the possibility to score at each eighth of an inch. And I also don't have any recommendations for a scoring board with which you could only score in centimeters or with which you could only score and not also cut in centimeters. And I also did some research to actually see what is out there for scoring boards in centimeters. And I just want to give you a heads up that if you're looking for a scoreboard in centimeters, make sure that not only the scale is in centimeters, but also these scoring lines because you actually want to be able to score in centimeters as well. And I really found some scoring boards with the scale in centimeters, but then the like lines or the guides for the scoring, which you would really need to score your paper, are actually in steps of inches, which doesn't really make sense. I don't know why it is like this. So yeah, just be careful. So now let's talk about tools which you could use for cutting and scoring. And as you can see, those tools now again have the measurements written from right to left because the right side would be where you could actually cut your cardstock and papers. And there is a tool I would recommend you to use for cutting and scoring, and this tool is again by We Are Makers. And this is one of the first tools I used for cutting and scoring. And it really works well. So you would use the right side to cut, just as I said, but then you could actually turn around this like mint guide here, and then you would have a border to actually align your paper with, and then you would be able to also score your cardstock along the scoring lines. And this tool is especially great for you if you want to start working with inches because as you can see, you have all those measurements labeled. So even the eighths are labeled so that you can cut perfectly and easily according to your cutting guides. And because it comes with a scoreboard, there of course is no grid printed onto the board. However, you could of course use the scoring lines as a grid, and this makes it perfect to align your cardstock with the scoring lines, even for the eighths. So different to the cutting board I showed you in the beginning for inches, this board is perfect because you can also align your paper with the scoring lines, and then you would be able to cut perfectly straight and also to score at each measurement line. And in this photo, you actually just see half of this trim and scoreboard because this trim and scoreboard can be folded. So once you open it up, you would be able to also cut and score papers in 12 by 12 inches. And you can get exactly the same trim and scoreboard, but with centimeters by We Are Makers as well. And this one now comes with a pink instead of a mint guide. So that's how you can tell that this one is in centimeters and the other one is for inches. And I actually haven't used this score and trim board myself with the centimeter measurements, but as it is exactly the same as the scoreboard with inches, I think it's totally fine that I give you a recommendation here because it works just the same. And on this trim and scoreboard, you can find the measurements for all centimeters and millimeters, of course. Only the centimeters are labeled, but again, I don't think that's a big issue because if you're used to centimeters, you know that this is the way it is. So you can just count the millimeters to cut your paper in cardstock. And then again, you would be able to only score at half of a centimeter. But again, with this trim and scoreboard, you would be able to align your cardstock or paper with the scoring lines so that you can also align it with kind of a grid at half of a centimeter instead of only at the whole centimeters. Now I want to talk about all those cutting and scoring tools which have the centimeters as well as the inches written on them. And this might seem very useful, especially if you don't want to decide yet if you want to work with inches or with centimeters. However, there are some things you need to keep in mind. So sometimes you will find one of those measurements on top of your cutting or scoring board and then the other measurements on the bottom. But keep in mind that with those tools, you either have the grid in centimeters or in inches, but you cannot have a grid for both measurements. And it might still be fine to use a board like this for cutting in centimeters and also cutting in inches if you don't mind or get distracted with a grid. But then if you want to use a scoring board with both measurements written on them, you have to keep in mind that here again, you can also only have the scoring lines for either inches or centimeters. So for scoring, I definitely cannot recommend using a scoring board with centimeters and inches if you want to use both measurements. So instead, I would definitely get a second scoring board to score my papers. And this brings me to a last tool I want to share with you. And with this tool, you would be able to score and cut your papers in inches and centimeters. And this is a tool by Craftelier Basics. And as you can see, you now have both measurements written on the top of the scoring and trim board. And what is different about this tool is that you actually cut and score along the same line. So there's only one guide on which you would score and cut your paper in cardstock. So this means that you would be able to cut and score your cardstock or paper at any measurement. So with this board, you would even be able to score your papers at, for example, 5.25 centimeters. But again, this is not something I would use very often, so you would be fine with the other scoring boards as well. And also keep in mind that with this tool, you again only have the grid for inches. But again, if you're aligning your papers with the top, with the scales on the top, then you really could use this tool to cut and score at any measurement point. And I actually haven't used this tool myself, but I will definitely get it once I'm back in Germany because this would be a tool I could use for centimeters once I would need to work in centimeters for any reason. And because this tool got recommended to me by a friend, I think this is a tool I need to share with you, especially if you, as I said, are not sure at this point if you want to use centimeters or inches. I think this is a good tool to start with, and also because it's a very cheap or affordable compared to some of the other tools. So, as I said, there are a lot of different tools, and of course, I don't know all those tools out there and I haven't tried them all. But what I can tell you is that it's definitely much easier to find a tool when you want to work with inches instead of working with centimeters, especially if you are looking for a tool to easily work with your measurements. So, with a grid and also with the perfect scoring lines as well as the labeling of the measurements. So there are much more tools out there for working with inches, and that's because this is a hobby very popular in the US, and also most of the big craft companies are from the USA as well. So to me, that's definitely an advantage for using inches instead of centimeters, and something you should keep in mind. And especially if you haven't started crafting yet and you really want to decide if inches or centimeters are best, I would say go for inches because this might be easier to find all your tools. And now I want to show you how easy it is to actually work with inches, especially when working with my cutting guides, when you have a good tool on hand. And as I mentioned, the tool I'm using for cutting all my papers, cardstock, and chipboard is this Guillotine Trimmer by We Makers. And again, this doesn't come with the eighths of an inch labeled. But even though they are not labeled, there are of course those markings or lines for the eighths of an inch that you can perfectly align your paper with them to also cut paper in any eighths of an inch measurements. You only need to be able to read those measurements, and again, there are only four measurements to keep in mind, and these are 1/8 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch, and 5/8 of an inch, and 7/8 of an inch. And as I said, you could either count those eights or you could use a ruler or a printed out guide, which can help you for identifying those eights. But then you will also get used to it very quickly so that you no longer would need a ruler or a guide when you're using this trim board. And because it's only the eights which are not labeled on this tool, it's actually exactly the same as working with centimeters, because with centimeters you also need to count the millimeters, and here you would need to count the eights to identify again if it's 1/8 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch, 5/8 of an inch, or 7/8 of an inch. And then for scoring my cardstock, I'm using this scoreboard by We Makers again. And this one is really, really easy to use because you have all those measurements labeled and then you have the scoring lines for each eighth of an inch. And you would of course also find the information in my cutting guides on where to score your cardstock. And as you can see, for cardstock element A, you would need to score at 1/2 of an inch on the 4 and 7/8 of an inch side. And the 4 and 7/8 of an inch measurement is printed in bold, so that means that this is the side you need to align with the scale on top of your scoring board. And then for cardstock element B, you would have to score at both sides, so both of those measurements are printed in bold. So then you have the first information for the first side. So the scoring at 1.5 inch applies to the 4 and 5/8 of an inch side. So that's the side you want to align with the scale on top of your scoring board. And then you can just turn around your cardstock for aligning the longest side, which is the 9 and 1/4 of an inch side. And here you need to score at 1/2 of an inch again, but then also at 8 and 3/4 of an inch. And as mentioned in the beginning of this video, there are also templates included with my cutting guides. So these templates are great to just double check if your elements are scored the way it's supposed to be. So you can see the scoring lines and you can also see how to cut your elements on the templates. And then there's another point you might want to consider when deciding if you want to work in inches or centimeters. And that again actually is something you especially need to keep in mind when working with my cutting guides and my measurements. So as I said before, most of the companies making tools are actually from the US, and the same applies for companies making paper pads or paper collections. And that of course also means that they are using inch measurements for their paper pads and paper collections. And the most popular size for paper pads to craft is actually the size of 12 by 12 inches. And this equals 30.4 by 30.4 centimeters. And then you will also most often find paper pads in the sizes of 6 by 6 inches or 6 by 8 inches. And in centimeters, this would be around 15 by 15 centimeters or 15 by 20 centimeters, which is almost the same as the size A5. And of course, you would also be able to get those paper pads in exactly the sizes 15 by 15 centimeters or 15 by 20 centimeters, or you could get paper pads in A4 sizes or A5 size. But this would be in Germany, and there are probably some brands with those centimeter measurements. But then, as I said, most of those paper pads are from the US, or even if they're not from the US, I noticed that a lot of brands are using paper pads in these famous like inch sizes. So for designing my cutting guides, I wanted those measurements to be very easy to use with those paper pad sizes, so that you could use all those paper pads for decorating your albums without actually having to trim them down to size. So this means that, for example, for my 6 by 6 inch mini albums, it's not the cover of the album which measures 6 by 6 inches, but instead it's actually also not the cardstock for the basics page, but the pattern paper you would use to decorate your basic page with. So the basic page and the cover are both larger than 6 by 6 inches, but for the decoration you would be totally fine to use a 6 by 6 inch paper pad and just get out your papers and glue it down onto your basic pages. And then I also wanted all those interactive elements such as flaps and pockets to be perfect for using journaling cards. So journaling cards is something you would find in most of the paper collection and also in paper pads very often. So journaling cards come in the sizes 4 by 6 inches, 3 by 4 inches, 4 by 4 inches, 2 by 2 inches, and 3 by 3 inches. So if you want to use some of those, you can choose an interactive page die fitting those journaling cards. And then again, you don't have to cut them down to size. You can just use them as they are and glue them down onto the interactive element. So now for designing my cutting guides in centimeters, I would do the same, but then I would base them on the measurements of centimeter paper pads. So that means that I would make them so that they're great for using exactly 15 by 15 centimeter paper pads or 30 by 30 centimeter paper pads, for example. So this means that if you want to use my cutting guides in centimeters, then you're totally fine with using centimeter paper pads. But if you want to use all those paper pads which are available by those big brands such as Echo Park, Simple Stories, or Catabella, you actually would have to trim the papers down a little before using them in your albums. And again, this might not be a big issue if you say that you don't mind if you have to trim down your papers a little before using them for decorating, or if you say that you don't mind having a smaller border of cardstock around your pattern papers. But I have to say that I really love working with my cutting guides in inches because, as I said, with all these measurements, I don't have to trim down my paper, or if I have to trim down my paper, because of course for 12 by 12 inch papers, I most of the time have to trim them down, but this leaves me with scraps which are in the perfect size to then also use for my interactive elements. So for example, if I trim down my 12 by 12 inch paper to use in an 8 by 8 inch mini album, then I'm left with one paper in the size of 8 by 8 inches, which is perfect for the basic page. And then I have another paper in the size 4 by 8 inches, which I could also use for pockets on my pages. And then I have two papers in the size 4 by 6 inches, which again is the same size as a journaling card in 4 by 6 inches. So these papers can be used for a lot of different interactive elements. And the same applies to using my cutting guides for different photo sizes. So for my cutting guides in inches, it's perfect to use standard photo sizes in inches, such as 4 by 6 inches, 6 by 8 inches, 3 by 4, or 3 by 3 inches. And then for the cutting guides in centimeters, I would base them again on the photo sizes, which are the common photo sizes in Germany. So this would be, for example, 10 by 15 centimeters. So I need to add here that if you want to use inches for crafting your mini albums, then the best would be to also use photo sizes in inches. But if you don't have the possibility to print out your photos in the size 4 by 6 inches, but only in the size 10 by 15 centimeters, then you would be left with a smaller border, or you can just trim down your photos after. And I myself print out my photos in the size 10 by 15 centimeters, but to be honest, like I'm totally fine with having a smaller border or sometimes just cropping my photos, because I just think that there are so many other different reasons to use inches instead of centimeters. And then there's one last point I want to quickly mention here, and that's that you would be able to find way more tutorials as well as cutting guides in inches than in centimeter. And that's it for today's video, so I really hope that you enjoyed watching it and that you find it helpful. And if you did, I would love to get your thumbs up, and then also if you have any feedback for me, please leave it down in the comment box below. And I actually would be really interested in knowing if you're using inches or centimeter, or if this video actually changed your mind, or if you already have changed to inches for some of those reasons, or really whatever feedback you have for me. And then I'm just hoping you're having a good day, and I would love to see you back in my next video. Bye!